Isaiah is a beautiful and deep and rich book full of so much to meditate on and think about and be encouraged by. Let's just talk about a few things that you might notice and might be helpful to you as you read through this next section of Isaiah with a couple chapters from the historical books at the end of this week's Bible reading. Okay, this week's reading in Isaiah begins with the end of the oracles against the nations that we talked about last week. And in chapter 24, there is this picture of judgment that goes across the whole earth. Maybe that's the summation of all the oracles against the nation. The whole earth falls under the righteous wrath of God. Everything is destroyed. Everything is wiped out. But after that, you get a couple beautiful images in the following chapters. In chapter 25, we see this vision of God in the future on his mountain with a banquet in which he swallows up the death that has covered like a veil all the nations. And then again in chapter 26, there is this statement that the leaders that the people have trusted in, the worldly powers, they die and stay dead. But later on in that chapter, it says of God, your dead will live. After the judgment, after this complete devastation, God is a God that brings life out of death. Okay, so in terms of the specific messages for the people, you see that God is trying to teach. He has this beautiful vision, this beautiful promise, but he is trying to teach. He's trying to show his people his plan, and he wants them to follow it. And so you get images like chapter 28 where God is instructing who will listen, who will take the instruction of the Lord. It's precept upon precept, line upon line. God is trying to teach the fundamentals, the basics to his people that they will learn about him and walk in his ways. But pretty quickly in these chapters, you notice something. In chapter 29, there's this picture where a book is given to someone to say, read this book, and they can't read it. Their minds are darkened to hearing the instruction of God. And why is that? Because of their heart. And that same chapter goes on to talk about those who honor God with their lips, a passage that Jesus will quote in the Gospels, and yet their heart is far from him. So because their heart is hardened and turned away, their minds are closed, and they will not receive the instruction of God. But in that same chapter, chapter 29, there is this promise that the deaf will hear and the blind will see, that there are those who will look to God and not trusting in themselves, but trusting in him, will have their hearts and minds open to his instruction and therefore to his promise of life. Well, getting even more specific to the situation of the people, there is this issue of trust that is strong in these chapters. There are these warnings about trusting in Egypt. In the historical books that we'll end with, you see that this is a time of great turmoil in both Israel and Judah, as many enemy nations are attacking. And the tendency was always to trust in other nations, trust in Syria, trust in Assyria, trust in Egypt especially. And so in chapter 30 and chapter 31, the people are told, do not trust in Egypt. It cannot help you. And notice then through these chapters that as God calls on his people to trust in him, he makes a promise of real, lasting security and peace. God says in him there is real righteousness. His kingdom is holy and pure and just. And in that righteousness there is peace, there is rest. And contrast that with the turmoil and the trouble and the attacking and the suffering brought on by the anxiousness and the lack of trust in the kings and the people of Israel and Judah. In God there is security, there is peace, and as we've already said, there is abundant life. Well, that ends a section of Isaiah, and then we pick up in chapter 36 next week with some historical material. But to fill the gap, we go to Chronicles and Kings. We read in Chronicles about King Ahaz in the southern kingdom who is trusting in other nations in this time of turmoil. And we read in Kings about the fall of Israel. And you'll notice that there's a lot said about that. It even goes back to recap why it is that Israel fell. This is an important moment where Israel, because of their rebellion, because of their idolatry, faces the punishment of God and is removed from the land. And it's supposed to be a wake-up call for Judah, but ultimately Judah will repeat the same failures of Israel and be taken into captivity as well. But we will get there, and that is week 35 of our 2020 Bible reading. Thank you.